Hello and welcome. Today's cake is a celebration of the return of those cheeky little elves. Our elves, Cookie and Peppermint, caused quite the stir last year. Let's just see what they got up to. All I can say is I hope they're a lot calmer this year. What has been the naughtiest thing your elves have been up to? I'd love to know. Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, let's get back to the cake. I've started off with 2 sponges, both 11 inches by 5 inches. I've used my easy vanilla cake recipe and substituted the vanilla extract for peppermint extract. It had to be done really with an elf called Peppermint. I've also divided the batter and dyed them in lovely Christmassy colours. I've made myself a template which is 5 inches square, which I'm using to make sure all my layers are the same size. This is the perfect way to make sure you get those really crisp, clean edges. The cakes have also been chilled in the fridge for a few hours, which makes it a lot easier and it's less likely to crumble. I then stack using my easy 3-ingredient buttercream, alternating colours and making sure all the sides line up perfectly. Once fully stacked, I cover with a thin layer of buttercream. This is also called the crumb coat. It locks all the crumbs onto the side of the cake so that when I add my next layer, it is completely free of crumbs. This then goes into the fridge and I'm going to prepare some of my fondant pieces. I'm using a small ivy leaf cutter. Okay, let's just pause right there. This is obviously a holly leaf cutter, not ivy. Let's just say it's been a really long year. Anyway, let's get back to the video. And a round piping tip as a small circle cutter to create some decorative holly. I'm using Sugar Flare Christmas Red and Christmas Green for this, so they really should be the perfect colours. I'm rolling the fondant pretty thin as I want it to not stand out too much and appear like a pattern on the box. Now, I don't know exactly how many of these I'm going to need, but any that I do have left over can be saved in an airtight container and will be perfect for some cute little Christmas cupcakes. I cut out a similar amount of round circles and then pop them to one side to harden up. Next, I'm going to focus on the bow that's going to sit on top of the box. I wanted to create a super loopy bow and all the pieces need to really harden up before I put it together, so you do need to do this the night before. Here I have some fondant dyed with a little Sugar Flare autumn leaf, a template and a pizza cutter. I've also kneaded in some Tylose powder into the fondant. This just helps it to harden quicker and to make it more stable. I'm rolling out the fondant and using the template I'm cutting out the strips, which I then fold over and seal with a little water. Now I really need these to stay in a loop shape, and the easiest way to do that is to stand them up and place some rolled up kitchen towel into the middle. This will support the shape whilst it dries. Make approximately 11 to 13 of these. It's always best to make a few more just in case of breakages too. Leave these for as long as you can, ideally overnight. I also made this really cool wood effect cake board. I have a separate tutorial on my channel on how I made this. For the edible shredded tissue paper, I'm using some wafer paper and I'm going to airbrush it to add some colour. You could leave it white though if you like. I'm using electric green and I also have electric blue, which I'm going to mix together to make a nice deep green shade. The good thing about using an airbrush is that it dries pretty quickly. You can spray one side, leave it for about 5 minutes and then do the other side. If you do want to add some colour but you don't have an airbrush, you can still do it with normal food dyes. It will just take a lot longer to dry. Whichever method you use, once fully dried you can cut it up in strips. As you can see on my wafer paper, I have 2 lovely green blobs. This is where I accidentally knocked my airbrush, but as I'm cutting it up anyway, I'll just leave these bits out. So, after a lot of snipping, I have a big pile of very straight pieces of paper. I don't think it looks very tissue papery, so I gently just scrunch them up to add a bit more flexibility to them and a bit more of a natural look. Now I've prepared quite a few pieces for this cake, I really can't wait to start putting it together. The last little bit I'm going to prepare is some lettering for the label. I have a video on how to use these fondant cutters on my channel, which I'll link in the description below. I've grabbed my chilled cake out of the fridge and I'm going to give it a top layer of buttercream, this time smoothing out as best as I can. As you can see, I'm pulling in the buttercream from the edges into the middle, and that will help create those super crisp edges. This is looking great, so it's going to go back in the fridge to harden up, and I'll continue putting it all together tomorrow. So it's now the next day and all my fondant pieces have dried. I'm going to finish off the label by adding the lettering to some white fondant. I do this with a little bit of water on the back. You don't want to add too much though, as it will make your colours run. I then use a ruler and a pizza slice to cut away the excess, leaving an even gap around the writing. I want to make this really stand out, so I go ahead and roll out some black fondant, adhere the white piece carefully on top and trim around the outside as before. You can use a ruler to help straighten up any of the sides. I need to transfer the cake now onto the board. It's hardened overnight, which will make it a lot easier and less susceptible to damage, although it can still be dinged or scratched, so I'm going to be really careful. I add a smear of buttercream to the board to allow it to stick, and using my offset spatula, I run it around the bottom of the cake to free it from the acrylic disc. The cake is nice and hard, so it should be easy to move over and position in the centre. I like to place it diagonally to the wood grain so you can see more of the detail that I created on the board. There are a few little rough edges around the outside, so I'm just going to neaten those up with the edge of my knife. I'm choosing to cover this cake in panels, which really helps to create crisp, clean edges, and as I want to add a lip to the top edge, it will work best. I'm rolling out my fondant a little bit thicker than I usually would. This is so that the lip can support itself and it looks a bit more box-like. It's best to start with the sides first and then front and back. This way the seams won't be seen from the front of the cake. I'm using my template from before as a guide on the width and height to cut the pieces. I'm making it about 1 inch bigger all the way around so I can trim it directly on the cake to get the neatest edges. To stick the fondant to the cake, I wet the side with a little water and then transfer my first piece over. I smooth out the fondant and then with a sharp knife I score down the sides. For the top, I use my smoother to hold the fondant up whilst I cut a straight line approximately 1 centimetre above the top of the cake. Repeat for the other side and then the front and back. To trim where the fondant meets, I like to use the smoother again to hold the fondant, and it will give me something to press against and get a really straight line. I'm also covering a 5-inch cake drum to act as a lid. I cover the top first and then panel the side so that it matches the box. I'm going to add some ribbon to the box to tie in with the bow. I use my template from before, but this time I cut it a little bit longer and then adhere to the sides of the cake with a little water. I'm making sure they're central and I straighten them out with the ruler. Once the box is done, I move on to the lid. To finish off the bow, I trim the ends with scissors to a point and then position 6 in a circle on the bottom. For the next layer, I first add a small piece of fondant to help raise it up a little and cut these pieces a little shorter before adding. Unfortunately, as I was putting them on, I was a little heavy-handed and a few broke, but luckily I had a few spare, so I managed to fill out the rest of the bow. So the autumn leaf colour is a really great base under gold, so I grab my edible metallic food colour and begin painting on top. It is quite tacky, so you need to move quickly and avoid going over the same bit as it will take the paint off again. I know it looks a little patchy and messy right now, but after a second coat it looks much better. Now my cake and lid are covered and the painting is complete, I'm going to add in my cheeky little elf. The lid is going to be resting on his head, but if I did that straight on top of a fondant elf, he would have a very squishy ending. To add support, I cut a dowel at an angle, just tall enough to fit my elf on, and I place it in the centre of the cake at the front. I take a little red fondant and shape a basic oval for the body and slide this onto the dowel. Before I add any more, I'm going to cover the top with the edible tissue paper, so I don't have to try and stuff it around the elf later on. Oh, this really isn't working and it is pinging everywhere. But I'm going to spread it out as best as I can. Stay tuned until the end and you'll get to see how I make this all stay in place in about 5 seconds. I continue building the elf by adding arms, a neck piece, head and hat. He's looking a little suspect, maybe a little creepy, but don't they all? Well, I find faces super tricky to make out of fondant, especially this small, and I think this is probably the best that I'm going to get. So we're just going to forget about that and just move on with the rest of the cake. Before I put the lid on, I add 2 more extra dowels near the back of the cake so that the lid rests on those instead. To stop the lid falling off, I make up a little icing and use this as an edible glue. There are just a few more pieces to add. We're nearly there, I promise. Please stick with me. I attach the label with icing as it's a little bit too heavy for just water, and then begin attaching the holly, yes, holly, in the corners. Yes, this one really annoys me too. Let's just ignore it and move on. So now it's time for my little wafer paper sticking secret, a steamer. I actually steam all my fondant cakes as it removes any cornstarch left behind and helps to really hold everything in place. It's also very hot though, so don't leave it on the cake too long or it will just melt and get completely soaked. Not what you want. Just a quick pass over is enough. Less is definitely more. While the board is still a little bit tacky from the steaming, I add a few little bunches of edible tissue paper on the sides. This way it looks like he's popped out the box and the tissue's fallen out. So that is my elf arrival cake. Good luck if you have any joining or returning to your household this year. If you've enjoyed this video tutorial, then please leave a thumbs up and do consider subscribing to my channel for more tips, tricks and cake decorating ideas. I hope you all have a wonderful time of the year, however you celebrate.